Welcome back to Face the Nation. President Biden heads to Poland this week, his second visit since Russia began its war in Ukraine. For more, we go now to Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning, ma'am.
So President Biden will be visiting Warsaw. We know you've said President Zelensky will also be in Poland. What do you expect from these visits?
Well, I expect that there will be a very strong confirmation of our resilience and our joint efforts to defeat Russia in Ukraine. Because instead of saying, as some Western European politicians say, that Russia cannot win this war and Ukraine cannot be defeated, we have to change the paradigm and we have to say Ukraine must win and Russia must be defeated. And I believe that the words of President Biden will reassure all Europe that the United States is with us in this fight for freedom and peace.
It sounds like you're referring to the French president's recent comments. Does NATO actually want Ukraine to win this war and regain its lost territory?
I believe so. I'm absolutely sure that this is the only way how we can restore peace and stability. I cannot imagine that Putin and the Kremlin winning this war and then peace and stability is around us, because the very nature of Russia is to conquer other countries. Russia has actually summoned the worst of the 20th century: colonialism, imperialism, nationalism, and this is the nature of Ruski Mir, as they call, and this is why it's such a critical moment in our history.
President Biden said he believes the war has to end in a negotiated settlement that's favorable to Ukraine. You said last year Poland doesn't negotiate with criminals. Nobody negotiated with Hitler. Would you negotiate with Hitler, with Stalin, with Pol Pot? Are you saying peace is not possible if Putin stays in power?
I just came to hear this interview from Munich conference. Munich Security Conference, very important platform to exchange opinions today. But in 1938, there was another Munich conference where all the leaders of the Western world succumbed to Hitler, and they believed they are bringing peace to their countries. And 1 year later, the Second World War broke out. We can, of course, negotiate, but it has to be on the conditions and under the definition presented by Ukrainians themselves. It's up to them to define what terms and conditions can be acceptable to negotiate with the Kremlin.
One of Ukraine's neighbors, Moldova, has warned that there is a plot to overthrow their government and open a new front in the war. An ally of Putin recently said that Russia should denazify and demilitarize Poland next. Do you see evidence that Russia is going to try to move into other countries, including yours?
Yes, I do see lots of fingerprints of Russian forces, Russian services in Moldova. This is a very weak country, and we all need to help them.
But in terms of Poland, you are in NATO, so the United States would have to come to your defense if you went to NATO and asked for it. There are 11,000 U.S. service members on rotation in Poland currently. I know your government's asking for more. Do you have any indications from the Biden administration that they will send more troops or make them permanent on your soil?
We are in a process of discussion with President Biden's administration about making their presence more permanent and increasing them. But I'm very grateful also for sending new Patriot systems and other very modern weapons and munitions, because this is also to some extent a proxy for presence of soldiers. But of course the two go in tandem. I also recall the words of President Biden from his last visit in Poland, when he said that every inch or square inch of NATO's country's territory will be defended, and Russia is not going to put any inroads into those countries. And I do believe that NATO countries, we are all very much secure, but it's not only about us, it's also about creating stability around us in our direct neighborhood. And if we fall to integrate Ukraine in NATO and the European Union, Ukraine will always be a buffer zone, which is not right.
All right. Mr. Prime Minister, we'll be watching that visit. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back with some analysis. We're now joined by Dr. Fiona Hill, a Trump administration National Security Council advisor on Russia, and former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, who is now a CBS News contributor. Good morning. Good to have you both here. Fiona Hill, I'd love to talk to you first. Secretary Blinken admitted Russia's not isolated. It's getting support from China. It's getting support from Iran. So does that mean the West's main tool here, sanctions, are failing?
Well, I think sanctions was never the only tool that we had. I mean, diplomacy as well as the military support for Ukraine. And I think, what we heard from Secretary Blinken and, the fact that he's just been at the Munich Security Conference underscores that we're going to have to really up our diplomatic game. Because, as you're suggesting here, a lot of other countries just don't buy that there's as big an issue as we see with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, they're always making comparisons with, the great power competition among the United States and Russia and China and seeing it as part of that. And I think, what Secretary Blinken and other members of the administration have been really striving to get across is that it's not part of that. So the United States isn't fighting over Ukraine for any kind of competition with China and with Russia. They're trying to help Ukraine liberate itself. That's the message that we have to get across. And frankly, if Russia gets away with a land grab in Ukraine, it makes the world unsafe for every country imaginable that has a territorial dispute, including, of course, all of the neighbours of China in the South China Seas and East Asia, and many other countries as well. India and China have a major dispute in the Himalayas, for example. And what we really have to do is to work with those middle powers, the countries in the UN General Assembly, to make that point that we're trying to help Ukraine liberate its territory from an unprovoked aggression.
Ambassador, you heard from the Polish Prime Minister this concern that not just the blast radius from this conflict, but that there will be some pushing of it beyond borders, maybe not overt invasion, but destabilization.
Sure.
When you were in the administration, you left in September, there was talk about the surrounding countries also being targeted by Russia. Do you think that's underway now?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen the story earlier this week about a potential effort by the Russians to undermine the government in Moldova. We've seen overflights by Russian missiles that were attacking Ukraine that have gone over the territory of other countries that aren't parties to the conflict. But this is a long-standing concern by Poles, by Eastern Europeans that have always felt threatened by that colossus on their eastern border by Russia. They've always described it to me as, when I was deputy secretary, they felt that they were on the front lines against this imperialist Russian state.
But this feels different. I mean, when you were here with us, last time you said, when you talked to Secretary Blinken, February 19th of last year, he asked you, how are you feeling? You said it feels like August 1939.
Right.
You just said the Polish Prime Minister invoked Hitler.
Yes. So what happened on February 24th last year, Putin pushed all of his chips to the center of the table. He went all in. You'll recall before February 24th, there was speculation about, there'll be maybe a limited incursion into Ukraine. Putin went all in. He went full World War II, World War I scale. This is war, and we're going all in. We're going to take down the Ukrainian government. We're going to subjugate the Ukrainian people. And by God, we're going to do with Ukraine what we wish, because Ukraine isn't a country. Ukraine is part of our Ruski Mir. We're going to do with it what we wish, what we want to. And you, the United States, you, NATO, anybody else, you can't stop us.
And he's betting on a short attention span here in the West, here in the United States. Vladimir Putin is set to give an address Tuesday. It's going to be his first State of the Nation since the war began. Very same day, President Biden is going to give a speech in Poland. What's the message you expect and should be delivered?
Well, I think what Putin is going to deliver is a message that picks up on what Ambassador Sullivan's just said. He's going to depict this as a great patriotic war. You know, they use interchangeably fatherland war, protection of the motherland. In this case, Putin has been actually trying to say that this is the third invasion of Russia. After Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars back in the 1800s, and then Nazi Germany. So he's actually portraying this as an existential threat for Russia. So what we would imagine is that he's really trying to mobilize the Russian population in support of what he's depicting as the fight for their lives. Now, President Biden's going to have to counter that. We have to counter that narrative, not just in Europe. And, you know, as we've heard from the Polish Prime Minister, we've heard from many other European leaders, they do see things in this same term as a rerun of World War I and World War II, in the sense of an unprovoked aggression by a great power in Europe. But they've got to basically, and President Biden's got to convince the world, the whole world at this point, not just Europeans, that we're in a fight to help Ukraine liberate itself, and that everything that Putin is saying is a distortion of history and of fact.
Ambassador, when you talk about the war in Ukraine politically here in the United States, President Biden gets attacked by Republicans in particular for being too slow-moving to approve certain types of weapons. Fighter jets, for example, for a year have been debated about whether to give them or not. Is this too slow-moving if we are actually in this incredibly important moment?
Well, it is an incredibly important moment, and I think some of the criticism has been fair. It has been, I think the administration, of which I was a part until recently, has been a little slow, has been cautious. President Biden, the marching orders we got at the start of this conflict was he wanted to do everything we could to support Ukraine, but he didn't want a war with Russia. And that's the careful balancing act that the administration has been going through.
But
Not
Vladimir
easy judgment.
Putin doesn't want a war with the United States either.
Vladimir Putin says he's already at war with the United States. He says the reason that he invaded Ukraine is that Ukraine, put up to it by the United States, was going to invade Russia. Ukraine was going to develop nuclear weapons. The United States and Ukraine were developing bioweapons. The times that he will use the word war to discuss what's happening in Ukraine is when he says the West, the United States and all of its vassals, the word they use, is actually at war with Russia. When he talks about the special military operation, that's the response by Russia to the war that the United States is already waging through its Ukrainian proxies. As they say, the United States wants to fight against Russia to the last Ukrainian, and it's all made up.
And those are the words you're going to be listening for on Tuesday.
He's going to absolutely. Fiona's absolutely right. It's going to be rallying the Russian people to support the fatherland in this what he considers existential war that he's engaged in Ukraine.
Dr. Hill, I mean, Ukraine's foreign minister said at Munich, the true end to the war will be when Russia's president comes to Kyiv, falls to his knees, and begs for forgiveness. That does not sound like Vladimir Putin.
No, but perhaps, 90 years from now, some Russian president might do that. And I'm saying 90 years because actually Ambassador Sullivan and I have some Irish heritage, and it took 90 years for the Queen, Elizabeth II, to actually come and ask for forgiveness in Ireland in a very highly symbolic way for many of the conflicts. It's not inconceivable that at some point, some Russian leader, not in the immediate future, would in fact ask for forgiveness for what's been done in Ukraine. We saw German leaders after World War II, eventually ask for similar forgiveness at war memorials, including in the Soviet Union and in Russia itself. But it is true that when Russia drops as a country these imperial aims, that then this will finally be over, but it won't be anytime soon.
Thank you. It's hard to believe we're a year into this conflict. We will be back in a moment. There is a mental health crisis in our country, and we are reminded of that frequently. For a closer look at what may feel to many like an epidemic, we want to bring in Dr. Joshua Gordon of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is the lead federal agency for research on mental disorders. Good morning to you, Doctor.
Good morning.
I want to start on one of these triggers. Senator Fetterman, a stroke survivor, checked himself into the hospital with clinical depression, and it has inspired a lot of people to talk about their experiences with depression. In his case, what are the symptoms of stroke-induced depression?
The symptoms of stroke-induced depression are pretty much the same as typical depression or depression that's not associated with stroke. Low motivation, sadness, challenges with sleep, appetite, energy, loss of motivation, and the like.
So what is a reasonable expectation and timeline for someone's treatment? Do they get back to their old selves?
Fortunately, there are effective treatments for depression, and those treatments do generally work for most people who have stroke-induced depression. The timeline, though, varies tremendously from individual to individual, and it's hard to make a prediction in the senator's case.
What is the typical treatment for someone these days? Is talk therapy still strongly believed in? Is medication more prescribed these days?
Well, given the typical severity of post-stroke depression, most mental health professionals would recommend a combination of medication and what we call psychosocial or psychotherapeutic interventions. So yes, talk therapy is still used. It is a very effective tool for depression, as are medications. And if the patients don't respond to talk therapy or medications, there are additional options to try.
You know, there was this recent CDC study about teenage girls, which was really sobering. It said nearly 3 in 5 U.S. teen girls feel persistently sad or hopeless, double that of boys, representing a 60% increase, the highest level reported over the past decade. What is going on with young girls?
Well, it is truly a tragedy. It is truly a crisis, and we desperately need to do something about it on a societal level and on community levels. The what is going on question is one that we can't fully answer at this point. A lot of people think, oh, it must be the pandemic and its effects. But if you look at the surveys that the CDC has been conducting for the last decade or more, you can see the slow rise in levels of symptomatology, particularly amongst teenage girls, goes back long before the pandemic started. So there are a number of contributing factors, but on the whole, it's a complex picture that we don't fully understand.
So what are parents supposed to do?
That's a great question. First and foremost, parents need to talk to their kids. They need to listen. They need to ask questions about how they're feeling. And if they're worried, they do need to ask the question, are you thinking about hurting yourself or killing yourself? So that's the first thing, is ask questions. And the second thing, listen to the responses and try to be there for your kids. If the answers suggest that your child is having more trouble than you think, or is thinking about harming themselves, or is otherwise having challenges going to school and getting good grades, etc., then parents should seek professional help.
Doctor, thank you for your professional insight. We'll continue monitoring it, and we'll be right back. We learned the sad news Saturday that former President Jimmy Carter has entered the final stage of his life and will forego any further medical treatment. Our Bob Schieffer covered former President Jimmy Carter almost 50 years ago and brings us his insights into Carter's career.
When the former governor of Georgia decided to run for president in 1975, it was not as if America had been waiting for him with bated breath.
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
He was so unknown that his surprise win in the Iowa caucuses brought headlines blaring the same question. But that race changed politics so much that Iowa became an obligatory first stop for presidential candidates. Carter tried to make a virtue of his lack of Washington experience. A self-made peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, introduced us to an improbable cast of small-town characters. But his best asset was always wife Rosalind. Carter's campaign came down to one simple promise.
I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement.
After the lies of Watergate, it worked, despite a campaign of dubious firsts.
The audio has been lost.
The sound went out during his debate with President Gerald Ford, leaving the two candidates just standing there for 28 minutes. Carter went on to defeat incumbent Gerald Ford, maybe not so much because of what he said, but because Ford had pardoned Richard Nixon.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
Like his campaign, Carter's presidency began in some chaos. He bombarded Congress with so many proposals, plans, and legislation, Washington couldn't sort out his priorities. The low point for Carter came when Iran's revolutionary leaders took U.S. diplomats hostage. The conflict set off a fuel shortage back home, and Americans faced long lines at gas stations from coast to coast. A military mission to rescue the hostages collapsed in an Iranian desert, and with it, Carter's campaign for re-election. The captives remained behind bars until the new president was sworn in. For all that, Carter was responsible for two extremely significant achievements. Negotiating the Panama Canal Treaty assured the canal stayed open to American ships, and American troops would not be needed to put down an almost certain rebellion. Even more important, Carter engineered the Camp David Accords, which remains the single most important diplomatic achievement in the Middle East. It took Egypt, Israel's most dangerous adversary, out of the conflict.
I would like to say, as a Christian, to these two friends of mine, the words of Jesus, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be the children of God."
Although he served only one term, Carter went on to become America's most active and productive former president. He visited countries around the world, serving as a mediator in settling disputes. His scientific work in Africa helped eradicate the screwworm, where it was said his was the presidential name most often remembered. His work in Habitat for Humanity revived voluntarism in this country. When President Biden visited him in May of 2021, the pair discussed cancer research, a topic close to both their hearts. Carter survived brain cancer in his early 90s. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter have been married more than 75 years, the longest presidential marriage in history. This is Bob Schieffer.
That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.